Muscular hypertrophy will be the opposite of muscular atrophy. Atrophy was the loss of the myofibrils, those myofilaments inside of a skeletal muscle cell. Muscular hypertrophy will be the exact opposite. When we think about the prefix hyper, that should tell us more, okay, over. Think of hypertonic, more, higher, right? So we're talking about the same thing here. The size of the fibers increase. Please, please, please remember that by fibers, we're not talking about the myofilaments. We're not talking about our thick and thin filaments. We're not talking about actin, myosin, troponin, all those guys. We're talking about the cell itself. In muscular hypertrophy, the size of the fibers increase, the size of the cells increase, typically in diameter. Okay, the cells are getting thicker, if you will, not necessarily longer, but thicker. This increase is due to an increased number of myofibrils, an increased number of those proteins that we talked about, the myosin, the actin, the troponin, the tropomyosin. Right? So if we're exercising our muscles a lot, they're going to react by increasing the amount of protein that's present. That's why folks that work out, their muscles tend to get quite large. Think about the guns that I have, right? My muscles are enormous because I have increased the amount of myofibrils contained within. This is why, folks, when you are working out, a diet high in protein is so important because your body is looking to increase the amount of protein molecules contained within the muscle fibers or muscle cells, excuse me. So there has to be raw materials to make those. We need lots and lots of amino acids, which we're going to get from proteins in our diet. Now, we've spent quite a lot of time talking about skeletal muscle contraction. And you say, well, okay, fine. How does that play out with cardiac muscle contraction? If you'll remember to our probably first lecture about muscles, we said that skeletal muscle and cardiac muscle had something in common, and that is that they are striated. They are stripes. They're made up of myofibrils, just like our skeletal muscle fibers. Okay, so that means with that striping, what causes the striping in a skeletal muscle? The sarcomeres. And the sarcomeres is what allows for, the sarcomeres are what allows for muscle contraction as we just talked about, right? The calcium ions coming in, binding with the troponin, moving the tropomyosin out of the way, the binding sites being opened up on the actin molecule, the myosin head clamping on there, right? Think back to all those things that we talked about. We can do that with our cardiac muscle contraction as well because everything is going to be similar, right? There's a nice photomicrograph to remind you that our cardiac muscle cells are in fact striated. We have those stripes that we talk about for our skeletal muscle. And because of that, we can make that jump that cardiac muscle contraction is going to be virtually the same as it is for skeletal muscle fibers. So that makes it easier when we get to 132, when we start off the semester talking about cardiac muscle and contraction of your heart and those sorts of things, you understand how that's going to happen because you remember, hopefully, skeletal muscle contraction. Well, that leaves us with our last type of muscle, and that is smooth muscle contraction. These muscle cells lack striations. We're not going to have those stripes. If we don't have the stripes, then we're not going to have those sarcomeres. If we don't have the sarcomeres, the contraction isn't going to happen as it would in a cell that has the sarcomeres, i.e. skeletal muscle fibers and cardiac muscle fibers. However, keep in mind that our smooth muscle fibers, because they're still fibers, our smooth muscle fibers do contain our thick and our thin myofilaments, as well as something called an intermediate myofilament. So this is kind of like Goldilocks. One's too thick, one's too thin. We have intermediate right in the middle. The filaments, however, are not arranged in a regular pattern. That's sarcomere. We don't have the striping, so they're not arranged in that pattern that we're familiar with. The intermediate filaments stretch between something called dense bodies. My next slide is a diagram, so it'll give you a picture to envision all of this. During contraction, the dense bodies that are attached to the sarcolemma, the plasma membrane, cause the cell to shorten lengthwise because those intermediate filaments are pulling towards one another. All right, so on the left side, we have two smooth muscle cells, okay? We have our thick and our thin myofilaments. We also have our dense bodies. What's going to happen is the filaments between our dense bodies shorten, causing our smooth muscle cell to kind of get clumped up, kind of looking like a chewed up ball of bubble gum, if you will. All right, so it's similar in that we have some of the same players, but because we don't have those regular pattern, that regular bands that we're familiar with, the contraction is going to happen somewhat differently. This will be our last lecture for the muscle system. Study hard and good luck on your exam.